Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for our Bible study tonight. We're still looking at Bible families. We're in the 12th of 13 classes on this subject, and next week will be our final class before we move on to a new study at that time. So we're very excited to be here and to talk about a family tonight that's kind of something interesting to talk about, one that we certainly don't talk about too often, and the reason is it's not as though it's a focused part of the Scriptures. But one thing we were thinking as we were putting this study together is that we've been talking about so many problematic families. It'd be nice to talk about a family that seems to have everything right. Well, I'm not sure that we really find that family in the Bible, because one of the things about the Scriptures is they're always completely honest. And even the best people in the Scriptures, the Bible's going to point out their faults or their foibles, the things that they do wrong. So a lot of times it's hard to find somebody who's without fault. In fact, I guess we might go ahead and say that nobody's without fault. But there are families that seem to have gotten it right, and that's a really great thing to have an opportunity to study. And in fact, tonight we actually could have studied a couple of different families in the New Testament, but we just picked one with the hopes of typifying some ideas that we can talk about tonight about a family of disciples. And you probably know already that the family of disciples we're going to talk about for a few minutes is the family of Zebedee. Zebedee is actually a Greek word for the name Zebediah, which means a gift of the Lord. And we know a little bit about this family because they're one of several families where multiple members of that family are disciples. So, for example, Zebedee, the father, the head of the household, his wife Salome, and his sons James and John are disciples of Jesus. And of course, James and John are Jesus' apostles. They're two of the 12 apostles selected by Jesus. There were other families among the apostles. Peter and Andrew were brothers, and it seems likely that Peter's mother-in-law may have been a disciple, although that's only inferred and not stated. The other family that's kind of one we could have chosen, but I felt like Zebedee was a better fit for us to talk about, is the family of Clopas, also called Alphaeus in the Bible. Clopas, Mary, and their sons, James and Judas. And James is sometimes called James the Lesser. Judas is also called Thaddeus, and in fact, just about every time his name comes up in the Scriptures, it's actually spelled just a little bit different. But they're also apostles, so it's kind of interesting for us to consider that we have a half of the apostles are related in some way, to another apostle. So that's something worth considering. And in two of these instances, we had all of the family that were disciples of Jesus. And so in this case, we're going to, and by the way, you might say we're making a bit of a inference that Zebedee himself is a disciple. It's actually never quite stated, but it does seem to be the case based on all the language. And the things that we know about this family is kind of interesting, and that's kind of why we have chosen this family to talk about. For one thing, Zebedee was probably a wealthy man. We know he's a fisherman, but it actually indicates he had more than one fishing boat, and he had servants that worked for him. That's what we get whenever James and John were called and they left those boats, because it states they left their father with his servants and his boats. And so that language indicates for us that they were in fact from a potential sizable family. We also know that James and John are somehow related to the apostles, and so to the high priest. And so because of that again kind of ties that in as possibly being a wealthier group of people and giving us a little bit to talk about. But maybe the thing we want to talk about the most to start off with this family is the thing that we just briefly mentioned last week. Last week we were talking about Jesus's family, and we said that based on the gospel accounts, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Salome, the mother of James and John, are sisters. And that would make, of course, we mentioned this last week, Jesus a cousin to James and John. Let me kind of explain that point to you for a second, because it's never a statement in Scriptures they're sisters. But in 3 of the Gospels, when it talks about those people who followed after Jesus died and his body was taken away, it tells us in Mark, for example, that it was Mary Magdalene, Mary Clopas, that's Mary of Clopas, the person I mentioned just a moment ago that was the mother of two of Jesus's apostles, and Salome. Now, then in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 56, it tells us it's Mary Magdalene, Mary Clopas, and Mary of Zebedee, or the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So that helps us to see that Salome is the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Not too surprising. But then in John chapter 19, in verse 25, when it tells us who came after Jesus, it mentions Mary Magdalene, Mary Clopas again. And then instead of calling her Salome, or the mother of James and John, it says Mary's sister, or Jesus's mother's sister. We put those three passages together, and what that tells us is that Salome and Mary were sisters, and that, as we have already said, that would make Jesus and then his younger half siblings, James and Jude, it would make them all cousins to the apostles James and John. Now, I want to kind of get into some questions here, because I think this is something well worth our time to consider. That here we have a family where everybody was a disciple of Jesus. And if not this family, then we can look at the family of Alphaeus, Cleopas, and see there a family where everyone was a disciple of Jesus, where two of the sons were actually apostles to Jesus. And that's a remarkable thing for us to consider, the nature of what it is that makes a family successful. What characteristics or attributes are present when an entire family are disciples of Christ? What kind of things are there? This is important. You want to know this. And a lot of us are able to kind of give information and ideas here that are things that are going to be some of the most practical things you might have ever considered. What are the characteristics or attributes? What things are there when this is the case? Whenever there is a family where everybody is devout believers. And George Watkins already gave us an answer to start off with. Appreciate that, George. George says, respect for one another and for the parents' authority. Helpful to one another. George, I really like your point here. Respect for one another and for parental authority. The concept of mutual respect is important. And as you see that in the characteristic of the family of Zebedee and the language there that we see that in describing that family, their relationship with each other, respect would certainly seem to be a strong part of that. Grant's got a comment here. Grant says, it makes it easier for everyone to fulfill their obligations for the family when they are cooperating. That's something really important. And this is kind of the idea that we've used many times to talk about that the purpose of a family is to enable us to spiritual things. You might think for a second what Grant is saying here, you might think of this in the sense to say, what was it that enabled two sons to become apostles? And part of that success is a common spiritual goal. They all wanted to serve Jesus. It isn't just that they, we believe or things like that. They all are followers of Jesus. And that's, like I said, we see that with Salome. She's someone who follows Jesus all through the gospel accounts. We also see that with Alphaeus and his wife, Mary, that they're always following Jesus. And those are some significant things to consider, that by that following Jesus, it makes it a lot easier for the rest of the family to follow Jesus. I want to make a point based off what Grant said there for a second and really push this hard. One of the things we're supposed to do for each other in a family is to make it easy to be disciples of Jesus. Let me say it again. One of the things that the family goal must be is to make it easier for the family members to be disciples of Jesus. Now, that might at first seem obvious, or it might seem something that we don't have to work on. But it's really not obvious, because I think a lot of times it gets missed, especially when families become families where we're more concerned about getting what we want out of the family relationship than to be a family that pursues Christ. But if everybody's on the same page, if they're all working with the same goal, it makes it easier. But that, as I said, is not always the case. Even in families I know where I would say they're all Christians, a lot of times they're not Christians together. They're Christians independent of each other. And that's not successfully enabling the family to pursue Christ. We want to encourage one another. That's what we talk about with the spiritual family. In fact, we talked about that just recently. Encourage one another from Hebrews chapter 10 and how important it is for the spiritual family to do this. Well, that's what the family of believers who are also family in the flesh ought to be doing. It's a good comment. Here's another one. Teresa says, no pressure to miss worship for family events. Wow, Teresa, you said it, Teresa, kind of the point I was thinking of in my mind, and I think if I'd seen your comment, I would have used it as my example. There's a lot of times where people are even Christians, but they don't realize they're not making the kind of encouragement to get people to do the right things. You know, if let's say, with my kids, I said, you know what, guys, all I want is for you to go, I want you to go to Harvard. And that needs to be everything in your goal. I want you to be a Christian too. And here's the mistake a lot of people make, a lot of parents make, is they say, I want you to be successful and I want you to be a Christian too. Guess what? That doesn't work. You can't be two things. You can't have two masters. It all has to go to Christ if you want to be successful. But I might say, no, I want my kids to go to Harvard, or I want them to go to some prestigious school. But then let's say I start looking around, I find there's no church there. How many times do parents encourage their kids to make decisions that necessarily cuts them off from joining a church family? I'm gonna say something kind of graphic and hard here for a second, but it's important. There's a lot of parents that kill their children unintentionally. That's a terrible thing to say, right? And I hope certainly I'm not hurting somebody unintentionally to say this, but I want you to think about it. There's a lot of parents that kill their children spiritually by encouraging their children to make decisions that will kill them, by encouraging them to pursue things that will put them ultimately outside of the Lord. And they didn't mean to. And like I said, they might themselves have been Christians. They just didn't appreciate how important it is to cooperate on the common goal of being disciples of Christ. As I said, I know it's a hard thing to say, but I've seen it. You've seen it. Parents who unintentionally killed their children spiritually because they encouraged them to pursue things or to do things that cut them apart from the Lord. Teresa makes that comment when she says, no, there shouldn't be a pressure. There shouldn't be any kind of encouragement to miss worship services. That ought to be what it is to be a family of discipleship. We're all pushing that goal. We're all expecting each other to push that goal too. Thanks, Teresa. Anthony's got a comment. He says they all had a desire for truth. That's really at the heart of all of these people, right? That one of the things that they had been raised with was a desire for the true things of God. And that really is significant. They all wanted, and Anthony uses truth in that way that I sometimes say the capital T truth, John 17:17. The truth that men pursue, that really is an important point for us to consider. That's what they all loved. You know, that love of the truth is what keeps people faithful to God. Stephen James has got a comment. Stephen James says maybe Jesus' close relatives would expect to be at the forefront. It certainly seems plausible. Stephen, I'm going to plug your comment here for a second. We'll come back to that here in a few moments. That's actually a thing we're going to discuss here in just a few moments. That's an important point, and we'll come back to that. So I'll put a hold on that. Cindy's got this comment. She says, being of one mind. That's unity, right, Cindy? And unity is important in a family household. Supporting each other to grow as Christians. Right on, Cindy. That's what we're supposed to be encouraging each other to do. And sometimes, by the way, Cindy, I want to go back even a little bit again to maybe what Grant said, maybe what Teresa said a little bit. But what you said, Cindy, is important enough that we ought to sit on this for just a second. When we say we're supposed to encourage each other to grow as Christians, that means necessarily that for example, if Wendy says to me, Brian, I'm going to encourage you to be a Christian, she's necessarily sacrificing things I might do for her so that I might do them for the Lord. I'm going to give things that maybe she might have thought she wanted, but she's going to say, no, devote that to the Lord. Give that to God. And Cindy, what you're describing here, the idea of of supporting each other as growing as Christians means that means we may have to make sacrifices within our relationships, understanding that God would come first. I wholeheartedly hope that my wife loves God more than me. I know that if she does, she'll actually be the best wife that she could be for me. But I wholeheartedly hope that. I pray that our young people at church find people to marry that love God more than them and are prepared to give more to God than they are to their marriage. And I say that carefully, not with the idea that they would exclude anything from marriage, but a person who's totally devoted to God. I hope this has become clear from our studies in the family and in the home. A person who is totally devoted to God is actually the best member of the family they can be. And the genuine characteristic of love, which is to want the best for somebody else, is manifested in a home where we say, give God the glory. Cindy, that's a great comment. Here's Stan. Stan says, it seems strange in Matthew 13 and verse 57, a prophet is without honor in his own house. It seems true about Jesus' brothers when they said, why are you not going up to Jerusalem? And that's very interesting to consider of some of those problems in that family. And as we talked about this one last week about the family of Jesus, it really was a difficult thing for us to see or to consider. So Tan, that really was a good observation to think about here. Got another question for you to consider here. Maybe this one's kind of simple, or I don't know. I don't know how you would want to answer this next question. But the next question is, at the time of Jesus' death, who seems to be the most devoted members of the families we've talked about? When I go back to the families that were mentioned just a moment ago when we were talking about, the family of Zebedee, the family of Cleopas, the family Peter, Andrew. What family members seem to be the most devout? I don't think, like I said, this is very hard. You might have some thoughts here. And maybe devout needs to be explained. Which ones seem to be the most dedicated to Jesus in these circumstances? And George has got an answer for us, and it looks like he's got the answer I was looking for. Salome was at the crucifixion, at the tomb where she came to help with the spices, and was with the women who came to tell the apostles that Jesus was not there. Very good. Salome, more so perhaps than even her son John. Now, Teresa points out John was there at the end, and that's right. But I would say that one of the things I think is interesting is that Salome, now you might not have noticed this, but from those passages we looked at a moment ago, it indicates for us that Mary, the wife of Alphaeus, was also there. I just think it's worth considering for just a second that in these homes, there's a consideration to say that while, they were all disciples of Jesus, maybe in the end, the most devout people were these mothers. That's going to come into play next week. We're going to be talking about families where there was no father involved, and we're going to be talking about a well-known evangelist, his well-known mother, his well-known grandmother, and going to talk about that a little bit more. I just think it's worth considering for a second that at the end, the people that were there, that were there pursuing Jesus and following his body and taking care of things there, it was these mothers that were there. And that seems to be something worth considering for just a few moments of our time. So we move on here to the second thing I wanted to talk about. I want to talk a little bit about some of the personality that we see in these apostles. A little bit, this is something Stephen James kind of alluded to earlier, and I didn't even let Stephen's comment in yet because I want to hold on to it for the next portion, not even the thing I'm talking about now. But I do think it's interesting that one of the things we know about the Zebedees is they seem to have a kind of a interesting personality. You might be aware of this, that in Mark chapter 3 and verse 17, when it is listing the apostles, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, it says there that Jesus gave them the nickname or the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. Sons of thunder. At first, in the past, I'd kind of wondered, was this actually a conversation about Zebedee? And it might have been, but there's actually an indication maybe this speaks a little bit to the personality of James and John. If you were to go over with me over to Luke chapter 9, I'll tell you what I'm going to do real quick. And And my computer has just told me something. I don't know. I'll clean this up there and get this to go away. Sorry about that. The computer didn't want me to read this, I guess. Let's go over to Luke chapter 9 for just a moment. Luke chapter 9, verse 51. And we're going to read here just briefly together, 51 through 56. It came to pass when the time had come for him, that is Jesus, to be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem, and sent messengers before his face. And as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. But they did not receive him, because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them just as Elijah did? Our lesson last Sunday was on Elijah at Mount Carmel and calling down the fire from God that consumed the altar. And I told you at the time that was just one of my favorite records in the Bible. And it must have been James and John's as well, because they said, can we do this? Should we go ahead and call this fire like Elijah did, a fire that was so hot that it consumed rocks? But he turned and rebuked him and said, you do not know the manner of spirit you are of. That's an interesting statement. You want to go back and look at that real quickly there in verse 55. You do not know what manner of spirit you are of. I kind of think it's an interesting statement to consider for a second, because he's saying you really don't get, kind of paraphrase a little bit, you really don't understand who you are, do you? And then he goes on to say, but the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went on to another village. So here's something kind of interesting to think about here and to talk about and consider for a few moments, the idea of the nature of these two men. And as you put these things, I use some terms here just that we might consider and we might think about for a few moments. Like I've said before, sometimes we use these studies as places to step out and approach an idea a little bit differently. And I want to approach the idea of what's like sometimes when people have strong personalities. And the idea of people that are of a certain kind of nature. And we might say here the nature of men that tends to be something that's really powerful and strong. I might say maybe in another way, this was an idea of being zealous for the Lord. And what's kind of interesting here is that really so different from other apostles? You know, I think Stephen James kind of grabs something like this when he makes the statement here that James and John may have acted pridefully and arrogantly, overstepping their authority. Stephen, that certainly might really well fit what's going on here. That they're really going beyond what it is that they're authorized to do. We'll never see them do this again. And that's kind of an important thing to consider. But Stephen, what I like what you said here is you go on to say Peter seemed to have strong personality among the disciples and things didn't turn out well for him. So Stephen, what's interesting is that James and John probably aren't the only men with strong personalities. And I almost kind of wonder, what if all the apostles were people of strong conviction and passion? You know, the Bible says Paul was a zealous man. Certainly Peter, as Stephen, you rightly point out, Peter was as well. And you kind of get a sense, what if many of the apostles or all the apostles had those characteristics of being zealous? And I guess maybe that's why we need to ask this question. The question is, what do we mean when we say somebody has a strong personality? Sometimes we talk about that like it's a bad thing. We say, well, you know, they really have a strong personality, and we might be trying to say that they think or do or act in a way that isn't always appropriate. So what might we mean by that? What do you think when somebody says someone has a strong personality? And then kind of follow up with that. Is that necessarily a bad thing? And I think probably that's an easier one to answer, but what do we mean when we say someone has a strong personality? When I said a moment ago, James and John may have a really strong personality, or Peter may have been that way, or Paul might have been that way. What am I saying in a statement like that? And what might be right or wrong about that? And I think maybe you might even be able to say that there is both good and bad in such a thing. I think that might be a good way of answering this idea as well. What does it mean when somebody has a strong personality? Well, let me just kind of start this off by giving you my take on a question like that. When I think of a strong personality, sometimes I think of it, the negative aspect of somebody who always has to have their way. And when I say it like that, that sounds negative, but what I mean is somebody who has such a certainty that they're right that they don't really ever pause to consider what it is that they're right about, or even the possibility that they're wrong. And sometimes, especially when people tend to be very intelligent or very competent in what they do, that typically they don't make a lot of mistakes, that it becomes something that they just presume. And sometimes when I see a strong personality, I remember many years ago, visiting in different congregations and a congregation where I was starting a Bible study as a visitor. And I said I would do so. And I had a man who took issue with something very minor. In fact, I was asking it as a question and he didn't quite understand the question, but he just didn't want us to go any further in that study. And he wasn't one of the overseers or a teacher of the class. He just had a strong personality is how I would have described him in that sense. So sometimes that's what I say in that characteristic. Michael Hetzer's got one about, and I like Michael's a little better because I think it brings it both to the positive and negative. Michael says strong opinions and convictions. It isn't a bad thing if it's guided by godliness. Stephen, you just actually took Michael, I'm sorry, you just took all of my point that I really wanted to go down the road with, and I appreciate that, actually. You said it very well. It isn't a bad thing when it's guided by godliness. It needs to be in subjection to God. Years ago, there's a book that was published called The Strong-Willed Child. And, some of us, have had strong-willed children. I say us, not naming any names, but, I would suggest that I can get a sense of what it is to have a strong-willed child. There's a temptation for some parents to break the will of that child, to break them down, to say, this strong will is just too much. But Michael, you said it well, because if a strong will is guided by godliness, it actually becomes something magnificent. It becomes something fantastic. And so really the idea of a strong personality, it's neither good nor bad, but when it is harnessed with godliness, it's fantastic. It's just fantastic. It's interesting. Stan brings out Luke 6 and verse 13, Simon the Zealot. Stan, that actually could refer, interesting enough, it could be that he was a zealous man, but it's more likely it actually refers to a political party. Of all things. We've talked about that in the past. I don't know if you remember Simon the Zealot potentially being a part of the zealots that were trying to drive the Romans out of Jerusalem. But if not, Stan, you're right. And Paul uses a similar word to describe himself when he says, I was very zealous for the things of God. So that's a good point. Lindsay says, we see many types of personalities in God's people in the Bible. Lindsay, can I add to what you said there and say we probably see all types of personalities? And I'm not sure I really believe that there are types of personalities. In our home, we sometimes take those personality tests and we pigeonhole everybody and say, oh, this is who you are. I'm not sure I agree that is always necessarily true. But Lindsay, I would say that we probably see all types of personalities in God's people, not just people in the Bible, but in God's people in the Bible. A lot of different personality qualities can function fine under obedience to God. And again, Lindsay, I would say that just about any personality, when it's, like Michael said a second ago, harnessed with godliness, you're exactly right. And that's important because some of us have strong personalities. And there's something that comes out of this, another question, in fact, that we have to come to. And that question is, if I'm that person, what do I need to do? Who do I need to be? If James and John were called the sons of thunder by Jesus, what should that have caused them to think about? That's the next question we'll put up here in just a second. But Stan's got another point here. Stan says we need to stand for the truth and not be willing to be swayed by every wind of doctrine. That's a great passage in Ephesians 4:14 where it talks about like being like a reed that's blown around by every doctrine that there is. And we're supposed to have a strong conviction. And that's going back to what Michael Hetzer said a moment ago, a strong conviction of who we are. So let me ask you, what kind of personality are you? And sometimes we might be timid, we might be strong personalities, whatever it might be. But the question is, if I can kind of see who I am, what do I need to do? And I guess maybe there's a really easy answer to this, and then there's also very specific answers to this. If, for example, I'll tell you what, I'll save the easy answer. I'll let somebody throw that one out first. But if I knew I were a strong personality, if I could see those characteristics, I know I have a bad habit. Let me tell you about some of my bad habits. When I get real excited in a Bible class and somebody's talking to me, I'll start talking over them. Well, that's a strong personality flaw. That sometimes, and I like to think that something has been said that's got me so excited I just can't wait. But it's also kind of rude, right? And I think a lot of you, nobody said anything about it. I appreciate that, but I'm very aware that I do that. I have to work on that. I have to make sure that I don't make people feel like I didn't listen to what they have to say. It's important, if we want to be effective teachers, to convey the sense that not only are we listening, but that we're trying to understand what other people understand. And sometimes, like I said, a strong personality doesn't do that. I remember years ago, somebody made the comment to me talking about somebody that they saw with a strong personality, somebody who was absolutely convicted that they were correct in all things. They said, there's a person that really can't be taught much because they don't have a perception of the possibility of being wrong. And that was a good comment. Maybe think about myself again and willingness to be taught. So that's something we might think about. Teresa's got a comment. She says, well, we have to make sure we speak the truth and with love and kindness. Ephesians tells us to speak the truth in love. There's a lot of times where you can just speak the truth, but it's not being done with love. But to do so with love means I want it to come across the most effective. If I'm not speaking the truth in love, then I'm just a clanging cymbal, Paul would say in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. That's a really important point for us to consider. Debbie said it, a strong personality needs to be harnessed by the gospel. I like your term there, Debbie, because harnessed is the idea of it's being restrained by the gospel. Talk about the idea of spiritual liberty or liberty in Christ. Our liberty requires us to restrain and to refrain from things that we might have the liberty to do for others. And particularly, sometimes that's a personality characteristic. Lisa's got a comment here. She says, you can change most negative traits, personality traits, into positive traits. Lisa, that is an important life lesson. That characteristics, a lot of times, that we might see as bad have also a good side of it. And Lisa, Paul's the great example of that. Of the guy who was zealous for the things of the law of Moses became somebody who was zealous for Christ. He took that zeal and put it on a different path altogether. And it couldn't have been easy. We know it wasn't easy. But at the same time, you're exactly right, Lisa. I think that if we are personality types, that we can, that any personality can have negative. If somebody's very timid, that can be very negative. That can cause lots of problems. But they can direct that personality characteristic in a way that is beneficial to Christ. And Lisa, that's a great comment that everybody ought to think about. And she makes the point to say you can do this through God. You're right. You're exactly right, Lisa. Stan's got the language in Galatians 5 and verse 22 as he talks about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. These are characteristics that might be personality traits, I think is what Stan is saying. And I agree. And Stan goes on to point out the idea of somebody who's timid or meek. Paul would say in 2 Corinthians 10, he pleaded in meekness and timidity. So that's a really good point for us to consider that. This is some great comments, everybody, and I really appreciate it. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this third question. It was kind of an opinion question. I was going to say, did John actually change his personality? And I'm going to say this. I don't think he did. I think John was just as zealous, but let me steal Michael Hetzer's comment. Or Debbie used the word harness, and Michael made that statement earlier. It was guided by godliness. that by the time John is a writer of the New Testament, that he has matured in Christ and he has directed those things. He's become the apostle of love, we sometimes say, because of the language of 1 John. I don't think he's any less determined than he was when he was calling down thunder. I think the difference is he had matured in Christ. He had put his zeal into Christ, into godliness. And I think all of you have brought up some great points to that end and to that point. Well, let's go on to our third comment or area here. And again, this is something that Stephen James brought up a little earlier. And I want us to kind of dwell on this for a second. I'm going to use a $20 word here, nepotism. And we'll come back to saying what this is. You're looking at it and you're thinking, I don't even know what that word is. Probably most of you do, but that's okay if you don't. Maybe you're a better person for it, I would say. But I want you to go for a second, if you would, over to Matthew chapter 20 in your Bibles. And I'll tell you what, I'll go ahead and put it up on our screen here so that you can look at it here as well. That there's a little event here that I've always thought is very interesting. The mother of Zebedee's sons, there's Salome, the mother of our family we're talking about. She came to Jesus, it says in Matthew 20, with her sons, kneeling down and asking something from him. Well, remember, this is Jesus' aunt. So I like to put some weight into that and say that here's an instance where, you know, your aunt, your favorite aunt, that I don't know if that's fair to say or not, but you know, somebody very dear to you comes up to you. She's a disciple. She's also your family. She kneels down before you. He asks her, what do you wish? What would you like? As she said to him, grant that these two sons of mine may sit, one on your right hand and the other on your left in your kingdom. Well, let me just say this. I would think that from a human perspective, a human wouldn't think that was too unreasonable. It's kind of like saying, hey, could you give if you owned a company, hey, would you give your cousin a job? That might not be unreasonable. And if you're going to rule a kingdom, well, you're going to need people to do important things. So would you make James and John those important people? And so at first, from a human perspective, I'm not sure that it would be necessarily something too offensive. And yet, let's go on and read what happened here. Jesus answered and said, you do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And they said to him, we're able. So Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink my cup and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with, but to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it is for those to whom it is prepared by my Father. You know, it's kind of interesting, just as a side note, drinking the cup that Jesus would drink, being baptized in the baptism that Jesus would be baptized. You know, we know from the New Testament that, not counting Judas Iscariot, that James, the older of the Zebedee sons, was the first of the apostles to be killed for the sake of the gospel. That's found in Acts chapter 12. John may be the last one. John chapter 21 seems to hint that, and traditions tell us that too. So it might be that John was the last of them to drink of the cup, so to speak, that Jesus would drink of. But the point is that these two brothers would reflect the spectrum of the sufferings of the apostles that they were going to go through. But it's interesting to note there in verse 24, it says that when the 10 heard it, they were greatly displeased with the two brothers. So Jesus would call them to himself, and he would say to them, you know, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. Whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. We'll stop there. That's an important teaching, but it's not the main point that I want us to consider for a moment. I want us to consider the fact that Jesus' aunt had just brought his cousins to him and wanted them to be preeminent in the kingdom. Now, this idea of favoritism is important. In fact, Sunday's lesson is going to touch on this, the dangers of being or showing favoritism, of showing prejudice even, we might consider this. But it's important to understand that the Word of God is very clear we're not to have a favoritism. Here's James chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. My brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality. For if there should come into your assembly, a man with gold rings and fine apparel, And there should also come a poor man in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes. You say to him, you sit here in a good place. And to the poor man, you stand there or sit at my footstool. Have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Verse 7, he says, you blaspheme the noble name by which you're called. Partiality is a dangerous thing. And one of the things that this brings up a problem with is that a lot of times in the Lord's church, we have families within families, right? We, my family, my wife, my children, and they're also members of the same church I'm a part of, the same congregation. So they're both my physical family and my spiritual family all at once. And we don't talk too often about that because we usually would say, like we've been saying with Zebedee, it's a wonderful thing whenever a family, all of the members of that family are disciples. But what happened here reminds us of the dangers of favoritism. In fact, so somebody tell me real quick, when I said earlier that word nepotism, what do I mean by nepotism? You probably have guessed it by now. What do I mean by nepotism? And here's the important question. How do you sometimes see this in a local church? How do you sometimes see this in a local church? Because this is a pretty important idea to think about for just a few minutes. When might we see the idea of nepotism in a local church? Well, if you know what that is, throw it out there real quickly and help us out here. But the idea comes to the sense that there are times where we are called and brought together as a family, and we're also with a spiritual family, and we have to balance the characteristics of our relationships to our physical family with our spiritual family. So I'm looking for some couple of thoughts here for us to think about. When it first of all comes to nepotism, what is nepotism? Well, if you were to look it up, I don't see anybody's got an answer there yet. If somebody were to throw out an answer like favoritism, that would be right. More specifically, nepotism often refers to favoritism, a favoritism that's found within the family. Favoritism that's found within the family. Now, it isn't just the idea that it's, and Wendy put it down. Thank you, Wendy. Wendy's got the answer. Favoring families, literally what nepotism means. Favoring family, you guys knew it. And so the idea is, it isn't necessarily terrible to say that to bring in family is bad. Jesus brought in family as far as some of his disciples and apostles, and that wasn't bad. But the problem is oftentimes the idea that we give a preference that's undue or inappropriate. And that favoritism is the favoritism that James was saying blasphemes the name of God. Rob's got something here. In some settings, congregations can separate into separate groups that favor some over others or interact with some over others. Okay. Rob, perfect. Rob, you brought up the answers we want to think about for a second. And I got to be careful here because I just want us to think about things for a second without necessarily saying that it's exactly wrong if I always go to lunch with Wendy. But what if, we're always in family groups in the church and we're never engaging with each other in other kinds of groups? We work hard in our congregation to break ourselves up into different kinds of groups. So we break ourselves up into men's groups. So we have men's Bible study. We have ladies' Bible study. Ladies' Bible studies are really neat because they also do some special things once a year too to kind of encourage that relationship. And they kind of try to break apart from the family, the physical family, to emphasize the spiritual family. We break ourselves into groups for group studies from time to time. But the idea is, and Teresa used the word that I was thinking of, the word is cliques. That a lot of times families form cliques. And those cliques sometimes get preferential treatment that maybe they shouldn't. And that's really dangerous for the family of God. That's what Jesus' aunt was looking for. And just the suggestion of it caused the other apostles, the other disciples, to get really angry. I think we probably could understand why they might be angry, that these two thought they're better than us just because they're related to Jesus. And the point is that in lots of congregations, it's easy and I'm going to say here in a second, a little natural for us to have a sense of closeness to family that sometimes gives them a degree of preferential treatment, of preferential points. You might consider, Stephen James makes a statement. Stephen says, Galatians 2 and verse 11, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. And I'm not sure, Stephen, is the idea here maybe let me try to fish this out, that maybe you're seeing the idea that Stephen or that Paul didn't give anybody preferential treatment. That would certainly be a good point about that, although Paul and Stephen weren't necessarily related. What I'm trying to say is that one of the greatest blessings we can have is to have our blood relatives as part of the Lord's church. And it's even a greater blessing when they're actually a part of the physical family that we're, the physical church that we're a local member of. But we need to be aware that it's dangerous if we create ourselves as a sub-church of the church. We need to interact with others. We need to engage with others. We need to appreciate the idea that we've got other brothers and sisters. Oh, I'm sorry, Stephen, I missed your point altogether, and your point's great. You said the point there was that Peter preferred the Jews to the Gentiles. Right, Stephen, that's great, because the Jews were kind of his family, and he was separating himself, not doing anything with the Gentiles. He wasn't even treating them badly. He just wasn't doing anything. Stephen, I'm sorry, I missed your point. That's a great point, actually, because that's exactly what was happening with Peter. He was preferring the Jews, his kinsmen, over the Gentiles, and he was condemned for that. And the point is that he was neglecting his relationship with the Gentiles. That's an important point that we need to see. Here's Debbie's point. She says it's a problem, I'm inferring Debbie is saying, when it's to the exclusion of others. Right on. That's exactly what I want us to see and understand. 1 Corinthians 9, verses 22 and 23, Paul used his strong personality to interact with different personalities. And he goes on, Rob, I appreciate you quoting the verse for us, to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak, I become all things to all men. That's an important point for us to consider. Surprised nobody brought this passage up yet, but you might remember that whenever Jesus' mother and brothers showed up one day and they wanted some of his time, that you might remember that verse 46 of Matthew chapter 12, Jesus was talking and they said, hey, your mother and brothers are outside. And he said, well, who's my mother and brothers? He stretched out his hand to his disciples. He says, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. We're all blessed because Jesus didn't show a favoritism, that he loved all of us, and he offered the opportunity for all of us to be brothers and sisters. It's so easy to get caught up in a preference for our immediate family. And by the way, we've run out of time, and I regret that, because one of the things I wanted to make a big point about is that we have obligations that we must keep. We must balance to our family. I can't neglect, even as the evangelist, as a deacon or as an elder, I still must first care for my family before I care for the things of the church. I can't neglect those things, but at the same time, I can't show a preference to my family that is something that's exclusive or inappropriate preference to others. I've seen lots of churches damaged because there were elders or preachers or deacons who would, be firm on other people, but when it came to their own family, there was a clean pass. That's a dangerous thing for a church, but it's easy. We all have a desire, a natural desire to favor our blood kin. And Salome, a disciple of Jesus, seems to be caught in that very same point. But that's not wise. The local church is your family. And you might be blessed to have a physical family amongst them, but don't neglect the obligations you have to that spiritual family. Don't deny them the affection that you can give them, that you owe to them, if you're going to be a genuine disciple of Jesus. Jesus didn't let his aunt dissuade him. He told his disciples, we need to love one another. He told his disciples, you're my brothers and sisters, and that's an important point for us to consider. We've run out of time. I really kind of wish I could have spent a little more time on this because it's kind of a tricky point I'm trying to make here. One that's not easy to point out because I wouldn't want anybody walking away saying, well, I'm supposed to treat the family of God, the church, exactly like my physical family. No, not exactly. You know, my physical family gets the best of me and the first of me after I've given it to God, and then the spiritual family comes. That's important. But the point is that I cannot neglect my obligations, my responsibilities, the affection I owe to the local church. And a lot of times people neglect or show an inappropriate preference for their physical family that was a temptation for Jesus right here. And Jesus withstood that so that we could all be brothers and sisters in Christ. And that's the greatest relationship. That's the one that's going to last forever. And I would encourage you as best I can to esteem that close relationship with those who are brothers and sisters in Christ. Jesus did. He loved that part, and he wanted us to consider that. Thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate you tuning in. Had some fantastic comments. I know I had to miss a few to kind of wrap us up, but I'm so very grateful, and may God bless you in the remainder of this week.